Already, another episode, another day. We're back with episode. Actually, I don't know what number we're on, but episode with Jarad, Professor Jarad Mason, assistant professor at Harvard. Grew up in North Carolina, went to UPenn, then to Berkeley, and now at Harvard. So very excited to have him on today because he certainly is more of a materials chemist. I know. Materials chemist and something I'm well not qualified to kind of really speak on. So I'm very excited to learn about his science today. So how are you, Professor Mason? Welcome on.
Doing well. How are you?
Keeping up. It's getting really hot here in Houston. It's like 95 plus humidity every day. So it's getting pretty bad.
Yeah.
Although I assume up there in the Northeast, it's pretty nice weather right now.
Yeah, it's getting increasingly hot though. It's going to be close to 90 today. So
it's pushing it. Let's hop right into it a little bit. So, like I mentioned, you kind of grew up in North Carolina. What parts of North Carolina you were originally from?
I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. So
Okay.
I was there until I was 18, until I went to college.
Is Raleigh a big city? Like, I don't even know how. I assume it's one of the
Raleigh,
bigger ones in North Carolina, but
yeah, relatively big city. And I was growing a lot while I was there.
mm,
But between Raleigh and Durham and Chapel Hill, there's kind of a high concentration of a lot of universities in the area. And so
yeah.
it's a
What's
really
kind of
nice place to.
what's like the staple of Raleigh? Like, you kind of obviously you come down to Texas, you hear like barbecue and stuff like that. Northeast has like their own culture. Boston's got some things, but anything there at Raleigh that kind of sticks out, or
In North Carolina, barbecue is also quite big, just a
yeah,
different style, so more
yeah,
vinegar-based barbecue. Barbecue, fried chicken, a lot of kind of classic Southern
yeah,
food, all really popular in the area.
yeah.
Biscuits, shrimp and grits.
You miss that kind of that kind of cooking, or you moved on.
I do. Yeah,
Yeah,
like what?
yeah. I haven't really been out to like that sort of area. The Carolinas is definitely somewhere I need to get to. Got to be honest though, the barbecue doesn't really sound enticing to me in general. I don't even really eat barbecue that much here in Texas, honestly. It's like a once a month type of food. I've never really been able to get into it all that
Sure.
well. Um,
Yeah.
so kind of coming up through Raleigh, did you have any like initial interest, within chemistry, within the STEM fields or anything like that, or you thrust it into?
Um, as I was growing up in high school, I started getting really interested in chemistry.
Yeah,
Always kind of liked more math, science kind of subjects throughout school, but when I first took chemistry course in chemistry class in high school, I had a really great teacher, and that's when I first started becoming interested in the area.
yeah. It certainly seems like how it always starts. Everyone, at least 90% of people I talk to, they're always like, yeah, everyone has like a really good like teacher or professor. I don't know, growing up. It seems like that always seems to be the catalyst for it, which is interesting, I think. Um, so talking about, you did your undergrad at UPenn though. So that's kind of interesting, I thought.
Yeah.
Any reasons you decided to leave North Carolina to go up to, Philadelphia?
Yeah, I was excited just to experience living in a different place,
Yeah.
around different people. And I liked Penn, and Philadelphia was a really cool city to spend 4 years in. So it worked out really well.
Uh, UPenn is right next to Drexel. So do you have any animosity towards Drexel? Is there a big
No
rivalry?
animosity. I had some friends who were at Drexel. Yeah, it was, again, nice having multiple universities in close proximity.
Yeah, I'm originally from Philadelphia. And I
Uh-huh.
grew up in King of Prussia. So, but
Nice.
very familiar with the area. University City is super nice. It's definitely like it's an older town, right? So like it's like a lot of residents, and obviously a lot of college students. So it's super unique experience, I think. Um, the University City. Um,
Yeah, it
uh,
is.
did you enjoy the, let's say, Philadelphia atmosphere and culture? Because I'm sure it was probably at least a little bit of a culture shock coming from, I would say relatively the South, I guess. It's
Yeah,
not as
Philadelphia,
laid back.
a little bit of a different culture for sure, but I enjoyed experiencing it, and lots of Eagles chants. Yeah, review went or or what was going on. But no, it's fun, a really fun city to explore.
It's it's funny because in like the Philadelphia area, like Go Birds, or I mean now it's Dilly Dilly because or Philly Philly because of the 2017 Super Bowl. But if you say Go Birds, that means hello, goodbye, how are you? Like it's kind of funny up there. Um, Now during your time at UPenn though, did you do any like undergraduate research or anything like that?
I did, yeah. I worked for two people. First, person named Brad Wayland. He was a porphyrin chemist, actually. I worked for him for a year, and then I worked for main group inorganic chemist named Larry Sneddon for about a little over 2 years on ultra high temperature ceramics. So we're synthesizing ceramics like silicon carbide and boron carbide from different polymer precursors, basically
Okay.
taking a polymer and burning it to make some sort of ceramic. Yeah, so that was the research I was mostly involved in while I was at
You
Penn.
might have to kind of explain that. Maybe those materials a little bit more because I am not familiar with like that kind of materials at all, or their applications for that matter. So,
Yeah, it's been some time since I thought much about them, but these are
fair
ceramics
enough.
that are very stable at high temperatures. So,
Okay,
and materials that would be like the leading edge on like ultrasonic airplane or a rocket ship, things that could survive at really really high temperatures. And the research we were interested in was being able to synthesize them from more processable materials. So, like taking a polymer, processing it into whatever shape you wanted, and then converting it to this really stable ceramic. So that was
that's
what
really
we were
cool.
kind of involved in.
Now, did you go into UPenn as like a chemistry major, or is that was there kind of a
Yeah,
different path there?
I did go in thinking that I wanted to major in chemistry, but I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do after that. If
Hmm.
I wanted to go to graduate school or still strongly considered medical school through a lot of my time at Penn.
Yeah. Uh, what was it about, let's say, like inorganic and material chemistry that kind of really piqued your interest? Because, you know, it, for those that don't know, I mean, I would say inorganic chemistry certainly comes in the latter stages of a chemistry degree. So most of the time, anyway. So sometimes it's like you don't even realize that you may not like it because people who take Gen Chem, P Chem. At least I took P Chem beforehand. Organic, obviously, is always a big one. So kind of curious to know
Yeah,
why you're interested in that.
I think I got really interested in inorganic and materials chemistry for a variety of reasons. I liked inorganic just because of the breadth of what that area of chemistry covers, both in terms of scope of materials, so our elements, and you have access to really the entire periodic table, all of organic chemistry, plus all of you know uh, plus all of
the
inorganic
fun
chemistry.
the fun elements like uranium and plutonium, right? That
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot that you can envision doing, and then there's just a tremendous number of areas that inorganic chemistry cuts across and can contribute to. You can certainly incorporate lots of very heavily physical concepts into your research. You can draw heavily from organic chemistry and advances in synthetic chemistry more broadly. Also contribute to answering questions relevant to biology or chemical biology, and to actually do research that has an impact in a lot of different areas. So that's what kind of drew me to inorganic chemistry, and then I was always partial to materials over molecules. Perhaps not for
mm,
any real good reason, other than just I really liked thinking about how to make materials, characterizing materials, and the types of things that one wants to design a material for. Those kind of
yeah,
challenges and way of thinking about things was always more appealing to me than more molecular kind of research challenges.
yeah. I guess for those that may not be as familiar, let's say with materials chemistry, like or like material science in general, definitely like when material science is generally more macroscopic. I don't know, it's more macroscopically, and the properties that you can get from materials is certainly more macroscopic in character than, let's say, a traditional chemical reaction or something like that. A lot of organic chemists do. Um, but something on so what piqued your interest about working with Professor Larry Sneddon? Like, what was how did you get involved with that sort of research?
Yeah, I took his, he taught inorganic chemistry, and so I took his class. And I think even maybe right before I took the class, I had known some graduate students in his group and just was excited about some of the research he was doing. And again, kind of the type of materials that he was making I thought were interesting. And I liked the fact that there was a kind of wide range of both synthetic and analytical techniques that were employed in the pursuit of addressing the challenges they were going after. So there was organic chemistry and synthesizing new polymers. There was some like old school boron cluster synthesis involved, and then there was using ultra high vacuum lines to do a lot of like solvent transfers and setting up really air sensitive reactions using a glove box, and then also burning things in a furnace and doing powder active diffraction, characterizing materials with TGA, thermogravimetric analysis, all that kind of stuff. And so I liked the fact that you weren't just really doing one thing, but you had a whole host of kind of techniques and tools that you were combining to try to answer questions or achieve some kind of
Yeah.
goal.
I guess, like I mentioned, I'm not really familiar with this area. So I guess when someone says like they cook the crap out of it, are you saying you like literally put it in like an oven under vacuum and like put it under high heat? And kind of a follow up to that is like, how do you do the analysis? I know you mentioned an instrument, but I'm not like familiar with it. And what sort of properties would one kind of be looking for? And at least let's say in your case, anyways, maybe there's a lot of different properties,
Yeah, so
but
for these reactions, we're using a tube furnace. So it's basically just a ceramic tube with a heating element that surrounds it. And so you put your sample in um, a crucible inside this tube, and then you basically heat the heating element to really high temperatures. And you can flow different gases on over the sample depending on exactly what you're trying to do. Characterization was mostly through diffraction, so identifying the phases that you made after you synthesized the material. And so that's looking for powder X-ray diffraction peaks that match what you would predict based on the crystal structure of the material that you were trying to
mm,
synthesize. So those are, that's a technique that I've used throughout almost all the research that I've done at every level and that we still use today for quickly identifying what you've made if it's an ordered material.
oh, cool. Um, so going from then, UPenn to then UC Berkeley, was that kind of a natural progression, or was graduate school kind of something that was always on your mind, or how did that lead up into
Yeah,
going to graduate school?
I was always interested in graduate school and was kind of deciding between graduate school and medical school. But I decided that I really liked doing research and kind of the freedom of academic research. And I was really enjoyed chemistry and materials chemistry particularly. And so I decided I was interested in graduate school and applied to several places and then went and visited places and just really liked Berkeley and the research group that I ended up joining a lot. Really liked the type of research they were doing and the environment, and was open to experiencing what it would be like to live on the other coast. So I was excited to go to Berkeley.
I was gonna say because spending 4 years at UPenn, Philadelphia, and then you go to UC Berkeley. When you get off the plane in California, like what was kind of like what are like some of the first differences you've noticed?
Yeah, the Bay Area was quite different from a lot of places that I'd lived. First, the weather is very different. There's not really seasons. There's a portion of the year that's a little bit rainy and a portion of the year that's pretty dry. Although while I was there, it didn't rain that much actually. Um, so yeah, lack of seasons. Very foggy in the morning. Um, cool most of the summer. Um, except for it would get strangely hot in October, November.
Mm,
For a few weeks. But yeah, that was one of the biggest differences. There's In and Out Burger, also
overrated.
a big
Sorry,
difference.
I gotta put that out there. I think In-N-Out's overrated. But
Yeah, it's not bad though.
it's not bad. It's not bad
Um,
food, but I'm like I don't know. I think it's
yeah,
I could do without. Um,
uh,
uh,
but yeah,
during
no, it's yeah.
wait, where's so Berkeley Bay Area? So it is they near San Francisco. I always forget where the California
It's
schools
across
are.
the bay, so it's in East Bay,
Okay,
north of
okay.
Oakland and east of San Francisco.
I gotcha. Okay. Um, yeah, at Berkeley, super cool. I assume you had a lot of fun up in the East Bay and San Francisco area. When you weren't in the chemistry lab, what were some of like some activities and hobbies? Maybe you still do them today. That you.
Yeah, I ran cross country and track in high school, so I've always
Oh,
enjoyed
okay.
running, and would often run in Berkeley. Um,
It must be
so
a
that
really nice runner's high up there. Like,
Yeah, running in Berkeley was great. Really good views if you got up into the hills. But I was working in lab a lot, but yeah, would enjoy running when I had the time.
now in at Berkeley, you did join Professor Jeffrey Long there. So I guess one is, what sort of research did you do your time in a PhD, and also, why did you join Professor Jeffrey Long's group?
Yeah, so in Jeff's group, I worked on porous materials, mostly metal organic frameworks. So
Those
class of
moths. Let's go.
crystalline, yeah, highly tunable porous materials, MOFs. And I was working mostly on research questions related to using MOFs to store and separate gases. So things like carbon dioxide capture for power plants, for hydrogen storage in vehicles or natural gas storage in vehicles. Most of my research involved uh, synthesizing new MOFs or existing MOFs, and trying to establish relationships between the structure and composition of the MOF and its gas absorption properties. So how you could tailor pores to interact with gas molecules in specific ways to overcome challenges associated with some of these kind of very applied things like um, CO2 capture.
Was
And I
that?
really like.
I was just gonna say, like, what kind of gases were you targeting? Or were you just kind of more, or were you kind of more in the not necessarily the application side of it? You're more in the properties of materials and the MOFs and stuff like that.
Yeah, we were going after mostly carbon dioxide and methane and
Mm.
hydrogen, for different reasons. I think one of the things I liked was that we would take really applied challenges like how do you effectively store hydrogen in a vehicle, and then think about some of the really basic science questions that needed to be answered in order to do that. Which, for example, would be like what dictates how strongly hydrogen binds to the surface of a MOF, and how do we design adsorption sites that have optimal binding enthalpy for like high energy density but reversible hydrogen storage. And then so we might not necessarily be trying every day to make the best MOF for hydrogen storage, but synthesizing a library of MOFs and trying to establish structure property relationships and really advance our understanding of what governs the absorption properties of these different materials. So that was an area I really liked to be in.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a really cool area. What were so were you looking at capturing? Were you using hydrogen as an example, or is that something you actually like tried working on, like capturing hydrogen?
Yeah, we did work on, or I did work on hydrogen quite a bit.
Okay.
So we were trying to design materials that would allow you to store hydrogen in a tank at much lower pressures than would typically be required in order to have a high enough density of hydrogen to,
Yeah.
drive a hydrogen car a reasonable driving range.
I,
Similarly with that.
yeah, I kind of want to stick to this a little bit because I think this is definitely an interesting point, and we'll definitely talk about it a little bit later when we get to your research because kind of obviously this is your area. But maybe we can start with just like what are the general problems with currently with storing hydrogen, and like why? Let's say because a lot of people may not know, like they hear about, let's say, hydrogen fuel cells or whatever for cars or whatever, but like the average person's like not going to know what the exact problems are with that. So I don't know. Maybe we could break
Sure.
down like why it's a problem or like what the problems are and
Yeah.
how.
So yeah, one of the big challenges with hydrogen or methane, really storing kind of energy gas, is the fact that it's a gas, and so gases are very low density. You have very few gas molecules in a given volume at normal conditions, and so you need to compress gases into and squeeze them at higher pressures to fit enough of them into a small volume. To be practical. For example, if you just tried to drive a car on a fuel tank that was filled with gaseous hydrogen at ambient pressure, just like we fill with gasoline at at normal pressure, you'd probably be able to drive your car less than a mile because there's such little fuel that's present compared to a liquid. So with any gaseous fuel, you need to compress it. Um, for hydrogen to get a reasonable density or a reasonable driving range, you have to compress to extremely high pressures, so like 500, 600 times normal pressure. And that can lead to some safety concerns as well as it leads to a lot of technical challenges just in terms of designing a pressure vessel that can withstand that high of a pressure. And so there's a lot of advantages associated with being able to store hydrogen at high densities, but at much lower pressures. And so that's where porous materials can come into play. Because you can think about porous materials as kind of like tiny, like nano sponges. So microporous materials in particular have pores that are generally around 1 to 2 nanometers size. So these are very, very, very small sizes. And the advantage of having these tiny pores, if you think about a sponge that you shrink down to like nanoscopic dimensions, is that you have a lot of tiny holes throughout your material, and that creates a lot of internal surfaces. So you can have really, really high internal surface areas within a material. So for some perspective, in just like around half teaspoon of some of the highest surface area metal organic frameworks, you can have the surface area that's equivalent to a football field. So huge amount of surface in a really tiny volume. And when that surface has attractive interactions or sticky interactions for gases, think about all those gases, sticking to the surface of a football field, but in a volume that's smaller than half a teaspoon. And so that's why you can concentrate gases to orders of magnitude higher densities than would normally exist in the absence of the porous material. So kind of like a sponge that's soaking up gases and concentrating them to really high densities.
That's super cool. I remember you kind of gave that talk when you were here in Houston. I was like, wow, I was super mesmerized. I was like, dang, that's super fascinating that you can do that kind of stuff.
They're really good class of materials.
So after your time though at Berkeley, so you did a postdoc with Professor Chad Mirkin at Northwestern. It was I guess at this point, most of the time when people decide to do postdocs, they are thinking about professorships, or maybe the job market's not quite right yet, so they kind of go off and do a postdoc. I'm kind of curious, your interest in doing a postdoc was becoming a professor on the table at that point, or what were kind of the decisions like leading into that?
Yeah, so when I went to postdoc for Chad, I was very interested in applying for academic jobs. I really liked the idea of having a lot of freedom in kind of the research directions that I wanted to pursue. And so that was kind of what my goal was, even though I wasn't sure whether or not it would be successful. That was what I wanted to try to do first. I had wanted to learn some different skills and learn about different classes of materials than I had worked on during my Ph.D. And I was intrigued by learning more about nanomaterials in particular, and how to synthesize different types of nanoparticles, how to use them as building blocks for materials, and how to employ a lot of characterization tools that were routinely used in nanoscience, like electron microscopy and things that I hadn't really used during my PhD. And so Chad's group was a good fit for being able to do that.
Yeah, so I know you kind of worked in the kind of use like DNA to do like nanoparticle superlattices. To be honest, I don't really know what that means though, so I don't know if you want to break that down a little bit.
Yeah, so we were using DNA as kind of a somewhat unusual surface ligand for nanoparticles. So we would take metallic nanoparticles, generally gold. They could be different sizes, different shapes. So you could have spheres, cubes, prisms, as sizes as small as 5 to 10 nanometers and as big as several hundred nanometers. And then we would covalently bind DNA to the surfaces of these ligands, or of these nanoparticles. And by tailoring the sequence at the end of the DNA ligand, we could control interactions between nanoparticles. So if you took two nanoparticles that had exposed DNA strands that had complementary base pairs, then they would stick much more strongly to each other than if they were non-complementary. So we could basically program what nanoparticle wanted to interact with what other nanoparticle. And so we could leverage those kind of interactions to build up superlattices, which are just a fancy way of saying assemblies of nanoparticles,
Okay.
where the position of each nanoparticle is ordered. So they form some kind of crystalline material. So a crystalline lattice, superlattice, just because it's a lattice of nanoparticles rather than a lattice of atoms. So on a much larger length scale. And then you could get interesting properties that resulted from the fact that you had nanoparticles that were in close proximity at very precise arrangements. And that would lead to some interesting optical properties in particular that we studied.
Yeah, so I know for chemistry, I guess sometimes we're not particularly the ones interested in like in the applications. We're just simply doing the science. But I'm kind of curious to see like where that sort of research like would be applicable. I guess like was there sort of like a how you say like I guess a long term goal for that? Like I don't know.
Yeah, there was some long-term goals. A lot of the interest, was much more on the fundamental side in terms
Yeah.
of establishing new kind of synthetic tools and, learning how to actually be able to control arrangements of nanoparticles in these extended materials, and to be able to, increase the phase space of materials that we were able to access. We were doing this mostly with plasmonic nanoparticles, which interact really strongly with light. Can concentrate light at really small length scales. And so one of the goals was to try to make materials that could manipulate light in ways that normal materials cannot, so-called optical metamaterials. And so that has applications in a lot of areas of optics, which you could do some kind of unique things with light that have potential technological applications.
I see. That's super cool. So following a postdoc, though, you're now an assistant professor at Harvard. So super cool. I brought you on the podcast because I remember you were giving a lecture at Houston, and I really liked I thought your work was super cool. Because
thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And let's go ahead. Let's hop right into it a little bit. If I remember correctly, I remember one of the problems you were looking at was like phase change materials. And if I remember, you were looking at, or at least one potential application of it was like something to do with like AC and freons, like refrigeration. You're trying to capture the freons? I don't remember, honestly. I'll just let you take the floor on that. I don't remember exactly, but
so we're trying to develop kind of new ways of creating cooling or heating devices, so air conditioners, refrigerators, heat pumps, that don't rely on fluorocarbon refrigerants. So pretty much every air conditioner or refrigerator and even heat pump that's in use around the world relies on some sort of volatile fluorocarbon molecule. So usually a small, heavily fluorinated molecule. These are refrigerants like Freon. And what happens is this fluorinated molecule is typically a gas under ambient conditions. You compress it, the compressor in your air conditioner or in your fridge, and you liquefy it. And when you convert a gas to a liquid, that's an exothermic reaction, so that releases heat. So you dump that heat to a heat sink or to the surrounding environment. So that's why the back of your fridge is hot. And then you take that condensed refrigerant and you expand it and evaporate it, just like sweat evaporating off your skin leads to cooling. Evaporating a liquid is endothermic, and that leads to the refrigerant getting colder. And you put the refrigerant in contact with the heat source that you want to cool, so like the inside of your fridge. And then you do that in a cyclic fashion. So you're basically pumping heat from the inside of your fridge to behind your fridge to make your fridge cold. Heat pump works the exact same way. It's just rather than wanting the cold, you want the heat. And so you're pumping heat from outside into the inside of your home. But in both cases, you're using these volatile refrigerants. The problem with these refrigerants are that they are extremely potent greenhouse gases. So carbon-fluorine bonds are really polar and really good at absorbing infrared radiation in the upper atmosphere that would usually pass straight through to outer space, but instead we're reflecting it back down to the Earth's surface. And so a lot of these molecules have global warming potentials that are more than 1,000 times higher than that of carbon dioxide. And
Oh wow. Okay.
even though your refrigerator or air conditioner is kind of a closed loop refrigeration has a system, these fluorocarbon refrigerants inevitably leak just during normal operation of any vapor compression cooling system. And they leak to a pretty significant extent. So fluorocarbon emissions are responsible for around like 3 to 4% of all global warming currently, and that number is projected to increase dramatically as there's increased demand for cooling as well as for heat pumps throughout the world. And so my research group got really interested in just trying to eliminate these volatile refrigerants entirely, and to rather than using something that converts between a liquid and a gas to pump heat, using a material that stays as a solid. So non-volatile solid refrigerant, where you similarly apply pressure, compress the solid. Typically that generates heat. And then you remove pressure, let the solid expand, and typically that leads to the solid getting colder. And so if you could do that in a cyclic fashion and control the direction in which heat is moving, then you have the possibility of driving these cooling or heating cycles using a non-volatile material, which would lead to zero direct greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we've been trying to do.
That's so cool. I actually, I didn't realize how big of a problem. I don't think anyone knows how big of a problem, let's say, like polyfluorinated carbons actually are, especially as a greenhouse gas. I didn't know that. So that's super fascinating. These type of, let's say, solid materials that you like want to compress, what are they made of, and how did you also like stumble upon them? Like what in the literature was kind of out there that you had seen to go with this?
So we were looking at some of these materials for some different applications. We were trying to make materials that underwent phase transitions that could be used for storing heat, so kind of thermal batteries. And in the course of doing that, we realized that some of the materials we were working on, while interesting for thermal energy storage, were actually even more interesting in the context of these pressure-induced phase transitions for cooling and heating. And so that's what kind of got us started there. We've looked at a variety of different classes of materials, actually both materials and molecules or more molecular materials. And so these have included hybrid materials, so things that have inorganic and organic components. Two-dimensional perovskites are one example class of materials that we've looked at. Some all organic materials as well, so no metal or inorganic component. And then some molecular transition metal complexes. So mostly iron-based complexes that are spin crossover materials. All the materials that we're looking at undergo some kind of phase transition, typically one that involves a high entropy change. So the larger the entropy change between two solid phases, the more amount of energy you can pump, or the more amount of heat you can pump every time you cyclically induce the transition. So you want to kind of maximize the entropy of your phase transition, because that's going to allow you to move the most amount of heat during a cooling or heating cycle. And then a lot these materials are also undergo phase transitions that are really sensitive to pressure. So that one of the biggest challenges in using a solid as a refrigerant is that typically solid materials undergo very small changes in temperature when you compress and expand them. And you have to go to extremely high pressures to get temperature changes that are comparable to those that you get when you condense a gas to a liquid, like a fluorocarbon refrigerant. And so these are pressures as high as thousands, or even in some cases 10,000 times ambient pressure. And so the challenge we kind of wanted to go after was, how do we reduce those pressures and perhaps reduce them dramatically? Because no one really wants to have a refrigerator that's operating at 10,000 atmospheres. So we wanted to see, how close can we get to the pressures that are already used in existing vapor compression equipment, which are more on the order of 10 to say 30 bar. Okay. So that was kind of the research challenge that we wanted to go after.
What I'm curious about is, so when you are looking at phase change materials, specifically, I guess, for this kind of environment, do you want large enthalpy changes and small entropy changes, or the other way around? Like what?
You actually kind of want both high enthalpy and high entropy phase transitions.
Okay.
So yeah. They're typically related, but you also, the enthalpy and entropy change dictates what the transition temperature is as well. And
Okay.
so you generally want to maximize the enthalpy and entropy change associated with the phase transition, but Taylor, it says that the transition temperature occurs at a practical temperature for whatever you're trying to do. So if you're trying to cool, then you're not going to use a material that undergoes a phase transition at 200 degrees Celsius. You're going to want a material that undergoes a phase transition at 0 degrees Celsius, right?
Okay.
And so that's one of the parameters. This is a relatively complex optimization kind of challenge because there's a lot of parameters that are important to consider. The sensitivity of the phase transition to pressure is very important, and that's influenced both by the entropy change as well as the volume change that the material undergoes. Hysteresis, so both in terms of pressure and temperature in the transition is important. So does the transition occur at the same pressure when you're increasing pressure as when you're decreasing pressure? And these kind of things impact both the efficiency of the cycle as well as, again, the kind of pressure that you need to use in order to induce the transition in a reversible fashion. You have to care about how easy it is to cycle your material. Thermal conductivity matters, all kinds of things that matter, some of which are correlated and some of which are not. But one of the kind of basic science challenges is really mapping out all these relationships. So how do we independently manipulate all the different parameters that are important to consider when designing a solid refrigerant? And then how do we use that knowledge to make better solid refrigerants?
Yeah, so we're certainly still in the development stage. That's a more fundamental understanding. It's super cool and exciting field to be in. And the cooling sounds great for funding too. So I'm sure it's all good. And anything with greenhouse gases, trying to limit that sounds great for funding. So
yeah, I know it's an exciting narrative.
But you also do some other research too. I know you do, like nanocrystal frameworks and porous nanocrystals. So I'll kind of let you take the floor here about those sort of research areas too. I'm very curious because I remember you were kind of really only able to talk about the phase change material stuff when you're in Houston. So I didn't really get a chance to hear about your other work too much. So I'll let you kind of take the floor.
Sure. So yeah, we got interested in some kind of different challenges associated that we thought could be addressed using porous materials. So I've always enjoyed thinking about how to design porous materials to interact with gas molecules in a specific way, particularly gases. And we, for a variety of reasons, we're thinking about challenges associated with gases inside liquids and inside water in particular. So this is a very long-standing challenge. That water is a very polar, strongly associated solvent, and so it doesn't really like to dissolve gas molecules. Solubility of most gases in water is at least an order of magnitude lower than most organic solvents, and so gases are present at extremely low densities in water. This is a problem that nature and biology has long encountered. Oxygen solubility in water under physiological conditions is extremely low. So you have just about like a single oxygen molecule in every 8,000 cubic millimeters of space. So if you imagine like an office building full of cubicles, it would be like having one person in every like 5,000 cubicles. So oxygen is very, very dilute in water normally. And so if you just have water and you have cells which require oxygen in order to synthesize ATP, and so multicellular organisms need to synthesize a lot of ATP to stay alive. And so, low concentrations of oxygen and water really limited the size of organisms that could grow. Because if you got too big, then just you were really mass transport limited by O2 transport in water, and you couldn't sustain cellular respiration. And so that's why over billions of years we involved hemoglobin and red blood cells and circulatory system, so that we could concentrate oxygen to much higher densities by covalently binding it at iron centers in hemoglobin. If you look at a red blood cell, you get about a 35-fold enhancement in the density of oxygen compared to pure water. And so then you have enough oxygen to sustain life. And so But transporting other gases and also transporting oxygen when you don't have red blood cells or a circulatory system is a really big challenge. And so we got interested in thinking about ways of developing synthetic gas carriers that could work in aqueous environments to overcome a lot of these kind of gas transport challenges. So it's a challenge for medicine, for example, say if you have somebody that undergoes or that has a heart attack, and the normal biological mechanisms for transporting oxygen fail, we don't have a good way of getting oxygen into somebody quickly. It's really tempting to want to just inject oxygen intravenously. You can't inject gases intravenously. You can, but only very small amounts because they cause embolisms, which lead to your blood vessels being blocked, and they can actually be fatal even at relatively small concentrations. And
Oh, wow.
there's other situations in which artificial gas carriers or oxygen carriers would be valuable, such as developing artificial blood substitutes, storing organs for organ transplant surgery when you don't have, they're outside of the body, bioreactors where you're trying to produce some sort of bioproduct and using cells or some sort of organism to produce it. The density of bioorganisms is often, or your cell density is often limited by oxygen transport through the solution. So those are all challenges. There's challenges on the energy side for electrocatalysis, so say like carbon dioxide reduction into like a liquid fuel. You often do that with an aqueous electrolyte, and you can be very limited by CO2 solubility in water in terms of the rate at which you can react CO2 at the surface of an electrode. So these are all situations in which you're limited by low gas solubility in water, and if you had a way to overcome those limitations, that could be potentially transformative. And so there was a lot of work done in the 1960s and particularly in the 1980s toward trying to develop new artificial oxygen carriers as really artificial blood substitutes. This was kickstarted by HIV crisis and a huge shortage of donated human blood. And so people have kind of taken two approaches to trying to design artificial oxygen carriers. You can try to mimic what nature does and use like cell-free hemoglobin or create some sort of like molecular heme mimic. So there's a lot of coordination complexes out there that people have looked at for reversible oxygen binding. It's really hard though to get oxygen binding and release correct when you're outside of a red blood cell. Hemoglobin itself is actually quite toxic when it's outside of a red blood cell. And so there's never been an FDA-approved hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier of any kind. And so the alternative approach that people have taken is to do something totally different, take a high oxygen solubility solvent. So perfluorocarbons actually, so things like perfluorohexane.
Oh boy.
Are heavily fluorinated, but liquids that have really high O2 solubilities. And so people have made emulsions of them in water and used the perfluorocarbon droplets basically as like an oxygen carrier. Those have actually advanced much farther along in clinical trials, and there was one FDA-approved perfluorocarbon emulsion in the 1990s. But there's a lot of challenges associated with using them, and the oxygen carrying capacities that they have are actually not that high. It's really hard to get to the same oxygen density that you have in blood. So we became convinced that there was an opportunity in looking at porous materials as gas carriers to overcome a lot of these challenges associated with transporting gases in water. The big challenge that you run into, though, is if you take most porous materials and you put them in water, and water goes into the pores, and you lose that internal surface area, and you lose the ability to absorb gases, and you actually wind up with an aqueous solution that has less gas than if it was just pure water. So what we wanted to do was to try to figure out a way to prevent water from going into the pores of these porous materials. But we wanted to do so in a way that the porous materials were still uniformly distributed or dispersed throughout the entire solution. And so the way in which we set out to do this was really kind of a thermodynamic approach. So we wanted to make materials that had internal pore surfaces that were really hydrophobic, so kind of like an activated carbon, where it would be thermodynamically unfavorable for liquid water to fill the pores. But if you take a really hydrophobic material and you try to disperse it in water, usually that doesn't work very well because the hydrophobic material is just going to phase separate, aggregate, clump up, and settle out of solution. And that's not going to be really helpful for transporting gases. So we wanted to make porous materials that had really hydrophilic external surfaces. So this kind of dual nature of really hydrophobic internal surfaces and really hydrophilic external surfaces, so that you could form really nice colloidally stable dispersions of porous particles in water, but where the pores would remain completely dry, but accessible to absorbing gas molecules. And so that's kind of what we did. We've done that with a variety of different types of materials, all inorganic, some metal organic materials, and shown that we can make solutions now that have extremely high gas carrying capacity. So we can make solutions that have just 4%, 4 volume percent of our porous materials, but have the same oxygen carrying capacity as blood. And then we get to higher concentration dispersions, we can get huge increases in gas carrying capacity. And this has proved to be a really useful and highly tunable platform that's allowed us to go after a lot of interesting areas, both on kind of the fundamental side and also on the applied side, in terms of applications mostly on the in the biomedical space as well as in electrocatalysis.
Another great area for funding. So you're always in the. It always sounds good to the reviewers. So with those porous materials, which ones have you seen so far that you guys have published have been really successful? And what properties have been what properties specifically are like, let's say, predictors of, let's say, being successful?
Yeah, so we started working mostly with zeolite that kind of had the type of properties that we were looking for, in that we had these really hydrophobic internal surfaces and really hydrophilic external surface. And so we had a lot of initial success there. The properties that we were looking for were mostly the oxygen capacity that we could achieve in solution, or CO2 capacity. And so these materials don't absorb gases strongly. So interactions with oxygen for the zeolite we looked at are on the order of about 12 kilojoules per mole. So these are really weak van der Waals interactions. We're not chemically binding oxygen like you do in like in an iron center in hemoglobin. But the surface area and porosity of these materials is so high that even though you have these really weak adsorption sites, there's so many of them that you get these really high increases in gas density. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. The advantage of these really weak interactions is that gas uptake is really reversible. If you equilibrate your porous material inside water at a certain pressure, say 1 atmosphere, and then you take your solution and it moves into an area where there's less oxygen present, so lower pressure, then you establish a concentration gradient, and gas gets rapidly released from the particles until the pressures match. And that happens really, really fast because the gases interact really weakly. And so that's what makes these really useful for transporting gases or facilitating the transport of gases in a lot of different aqueous environments.
That's super cool. Well, I believe you have to go soon. So, Professor Mason, I want to thank you so much for your time and consideration. You were such a pleasure talking to you. Really excited to see your future work in this area. So, if there's any prospective students,
thanks for having me on the podcast. It was a pleasure.
If there's any prospective students up there who are interested in material science and inorganic, take a look at Harvard and go and join Professor Mason's group. But thank you for another episode. And I guess we'll see you in the next one.